Okay, so I'm going to start off talking about basic environmental setup in Rhino. And with Rhino 5, they included a lot of new features to generate real-time kind of simulation of shading and shadows and sun systems right within Rhino. And you can use this to kind of get a view of what's going on your site right as you're designing without having to render or do any of these other things. So the first thing we want to do is I have this site in Brooklyn, and there's some of the context buildings here. So the first thing you can do, it's very basic, is to set up your viewport properties. So there's different ways to visualize geometry in Rhino. The most basic one is wireframe. You can also go to shaded mode. This gives you some of the solid surfaces. And then there's rendered mode. And rendered mode gives you a very basic simulation of what the material properties are. So in Rhino, there's the color of the surfaces. These show up in your shaded view. And there's also these materials. This is the circle icons here. So whether you're working with the internal render or with V-Ray, you can set very basic surfaces by layer just by clicking here. So in this case, I have the site and I have some buildings. So the site, I'm just going to give a very basic gray color. And then for the buildings, a slightly darker gray. So I'm just changing the color here, but what's happening is that's creating some basic materials just with a diffuse shader on it. And I just did this to differentiate between the buildings and the site. And then I'm just going to make a quick form that we're going to use as the basis for our analysis. All right, so I just have some form that I'm going to do analysis to see what the effect of the shadows are of the surrounding buildings and what the effect of this form is on the site. So the first thing you can do is turn on the shadows in your viewport. So if you're in rendered mode here, let me give this a different material. You can see that's the materials are, you get a preview of them. If you go to the viewport, the arrow, go to display options. These are all the options within Rhino, but within view, you have all of your setup viewports, and you can change all the options within them. So right now we're in rendered view. If you go here to the plus icon, you can go to shadows and just turn the shadows on. You see right away that there's some preview shadow here, and you can adjust different parameters like the accuracy, soft edge, blurring, things like that to make it a little bit better. This is just a preview, so it's very inaccurate, and you can see that it has a really hard time actually with this kind of topography. So I have this surface here, it's very complex, and it has a hard time approximating what the shadows are like. Okay, so if I do a very basic example here, you see it's a little bit better. Still a few errors. Okay, so by default, if you turn on shadows, the light it uses for the shadows is the default Rhino lighting, which actually is placed behind your camera. So you can see as I move the camera, the light moves with it and the shadow moves. So it's not very realistic. It might give you a nice kind of volumetric image, but it's not going to give you the realistic shading of the site. To fix that, we can install any number of lights in our scene, but Rhino actually also comes with a sun modeler, which will create a specific light source that models the sun at any given time of the day and year. So to turn that on, you can just type in sun in your command line, and it'll pull up these sun environment options. If you're using the built-in renderer or other renderers, you might get different options here. I'm in V-Ray right now, which I think is mostly what people use. And you set that here, current renderer. So right now I'm in V-Ray, so I don't get some of the built-in Rhino environment variables, but I do get the sun. So if you turn the sun on, you see that now the shadow is fixed. And you can scrub through the day and time to get a realistic image of what the shadow is going to do. So here are the months of the year. Here are the times along the day. You can also set your position in the world. If you scroll down the location area, you can type in a location, or you can just click here and it'll figure out where you are in the world and give you the latitude and longitude.
Does the orientation of the model matter?
Yes. So Rhino assumes that you're working with north being up Y, which is typical. If you have a project north, you can actually set that here. So I have it actually set to 90 because I was working with 90 degrees north, but typically you have this at 0. You can see what it does, just rotate the sun. You can also, if the actual orientation isn't super important, you can do manual control and just set the sun yourself. So you can see that just by doing this preview, you can already get a sense of what's going on in your site. And this is the first and a key moment where you can get some sense of simulation and environment analysis without getting anything numeric or going to different software, having any other process. Like you can already start to say, okay, well, if I don't want to cast shadows on a certain part of the site, maybe I move my building around and the shadow will follow along. You can see that the preview itself is not very good. So what we actually want to do is use the renderer to get a much more precise simulation of what's actually going on with the shadows. So the cool thing about the sun setup is that V-Ray also recognizes the sun in your model. Once you activate the sun, you can see it's on here. And if you go to the lights, the sun is activated. So this sun will always be in your model, but when you open up a new model, it'll just be turned off by default. So if you turn it on, V-Ray will also start to work with the sun. Okay, so by default, these will be your default settings in V-Ray. And if you hit render now, you see that everything is super blown out. And this is because to get an accurate model of the sun dynamics and shading in Rhino, the sun light is extremely bright. And you don't want to change that. You want to keep that because it's really tied to how the lighting and the shading works within Rhino. So what you want to do to counteract that, it's really easy. You just turn on the physical camera in V-Ray. The physical camera is specially made to be adjusted to the correct lighting solution in the model. And once you turn that on, you can adjust your exposure with typical sort of camera controls. So if the scene's too bright, you can increase the speed of the shutter, you can increase the f-stop, you can increase the speed of the film. It's a typical kind of camera. And if you don't know, you can just Wikipedia it. These three are related to how much exposure is coming in through the lens. Okay, so if we hit render now, you can see that it's a little bit better. The ground's still blown out. And obviously the kind of final colors in your model have everything to do with a combination of materials, lighting, and camera, right? So either of those can be tweaked. So in this case, this color is coming through pretty good, but the ground is too bright. I can either change my camera properties, increase the speed to make it all darker, or I can go in and make my site darker, okay? So here's my rendering. You can see that V-Ray has taken the sun in our model to cast the right shadows. So as you adjust the sun, V-Ray will automatically adjust its shadows as well. See now, we can visualize what's going on in the evening at different parts of the year. You can see that the whole environment is changing color. That's because the dynamic sunlight, as it's changing position, it's also changing its color to approximate what's going on in the environment. And that's why you don't really want to tweak the sunlight itself, because it's really set up to be dynamic. It's better to change your camera to get into the range of the sunlight. Okay, so the last thing we want to do here is actually set up the V-Ray environment to link to the sunlight. Right now, they're kind of separate. You get the color from the sun, but you don't have the changing environmental light to follow it. That's also pretty easy to do in the V-Ray settings. And the V-Ray settings I got from going to the V-Ray toolbar, clicking on options. You go down to environment. So by default, the skylight and the background are just set to colors with a multiplier. So this will just give you like a general white background fill color, which works pretty well for like kind of abstract renderings. But if we want something more realistic, we can change this to a sky simulation texture. And that sky simulation texture will also change dynamically based on your position of the sun. So to enable that, you just hit this M. There's a lot of moments in V-Ray where it asks you for either color or a map. So if you want the map, you hit this little M. Here it's set to none. So we want to go down and go to texture, sky. Okay, so this is a built-in sky simulator. And here, up here where it says sun, we want to link it to the Rhino document sun. If you make a different sunlight, say you want to make your own sun, you'd make a directional light, and then you can link it here to the environment. But since we just have the Rhino document sun, we'll link it here, and just make sure that's enabled. Here. Click OK. And then you want to do that for the reflection background as well. The reflection background is really useful when you have reflective surfaces like windows. It gives us something to reflect actually. So instead of reflecting just general black background, it'll reflect a simulated sky. And again, make sure that the sun is enabled. Okay, so that's all set up. I'm going to pick a more daytime version of this. Hit render. And you can see that now there's a general kind of background light in our model. The shadows aren't as hard. Right? And this is really typical that you would get a color of the sun in direct light, and then you get a bluish shadow from the skylight because it's bouncing back a bluish color. And again, these maps, these background maps will follow your sun. So if you do something late evening, the whole atmosphere sort of changes to reflect that. It also creates a background for your viewport. So if you want a more like perspective view, you can see it creates like a pseudo sky background. So do it earlier in the day, the whole thing brightens up. So this is just like a very quick way to do renderings as a way to show how your form interacts with its environment. That's really the goal here. There's not a lot of setup. You don't have to tweak all these materials and make it look super photorealistic, but it is realistic in terms of the effects that it has on its surroundings.